Now, let's talk about references, mainly gathering references. This is a step that can be easily overlooked, and it shouldn't, because it is extremely important for you to understand your subject and understand what you will have to create. So, when you are looking for references about your subject, you want to look at some different things. So, you can already see a bit of what I have, but I will go in depth. First of all, you want to get different things on different scales in relation to the distance from the camera. What I mean by this is you want to have the big shapes, you want to understand the little details, and you want to understand the mid shapes and mid details. If we start from the bigger scale, we have the shape, or what I call the shape, and to me this is essentially images that give you the main silhouette of your subject, the main vibe, and the main visual cues. When you are looking at it from a distance, this will be quite important because when you are creating vegetation for games, you are limited by the poly count, and having a strong silhouette will give you like 70% of what you need, and everything else will be just the details. Those details are still important, mainly if the player can get close to the tree or if we are talking about a realistic game. So after you get those big shape references, you want to look into the branches. So branches are important and tricky at the same time because this will give you most of the answers of how to build your texture atlas and understand the structure of your tree. And when I'm looking for references of branches, or if I can take them myself, I usually like references from the bottom because they really make it easy to read what's going on, and what you want to take away from these references is really just the structure, understanding how many levels of growth a tree has. You have the main branches, then you have the secondary ones, and then you have tertiary ones, and then when do the leaves actually show up, because this actually changes a lot from tree to tree. So those are quite important for that step. Then you also want to look into leaves. That's another step. So you want not only to see how they are attached to the branches, but you also want to understand how they connect with what we were seeing before. You want to see the details as well, in case you have to create your own textures. You can, for example, use photo source textures for your leaves, but if you don't have access to some of those, you might want to sculpt your own leaves and do like a Substance Painter pass or wherever you like, but you will need those close-up references, of course. The same thing for the fruits. Even though pine cones are not essentially fruits, they kind of grow in a similar way on trees. And then we have the bark. This one I think is kind of self-explanatory. So you want to understand the bark, you might want to scan your own bark, or you might want to create it in Substance Designer or use one from a library. And then we have extra details based on variations, details, and context. So what is this about? You want to have your subject at different stages of life if possible. What I mean by this is having younger and older trees. Like you want to understand how the big tree is built when it's fully grown, and you want to understand how it looks when it is in midlife. For example, that is the case here. And then you also want to get some references of the saplings and how they look when they are small. Because if you are creating a whole set of trees for a game, you will want those different versions to create realistic forests, something that makes sense. Besides that, you have differences based on seasons or location. These will be, for example, looking at the tree in the summer and then that same tree in the fall and that same tree in the winter. Actually, trees that lose their leaves in the fall or winter are perfect to understand the structure. If you have the leaves occluding the small branches behind it, it becomes a bit harder to understand what's going on, but when they are like this, it's just perfect to really translate it into your texture atlas. Then you also have differences based on context, and I have two different ones here. One of them is geographical, so a tree in different parts of the world can look quite different. For example, our subject will be a pine tree that I noticed a while back when I was going to Portugal by car, that this same tree in the south of France, which tends to be a little bit more humid and rainy, has a tendency to grow quite different than it does back home in Portugal, where the weather is drier. The other context is where is your tree growing in relation to the other things in its surrounding. For example, a tree in an open field will usually grow much larger to the sides but won't be as tall. But if you're talking about a tree in a forest, it will be taller and thinner instead. Or if it's a city environment where people cut their branches quite often, it will look different from all the previous situations. This is the context you should try to understand. Like, is your tree going to be used in a city environment or is it going to be used in a forest environment? All those things will be quite important to give the exact look you need and give it a story, or if you want, a kind of storytelling and then some extra details. So in this case, this tree, for example, has some kind of peeling bark, which could be interesting to add. And these ones, for example, are being used to get the sap from them. So you might want to have these kind of details, or these ones which have some kind of very detailed broken branches towards the bottom. Anything you feel you will need to make the tree shine. Still talking about gathering references and some tips that can be important or can help you understand where to find things and how to find them. I'm of course not going to be teaching how to use Google, but there are a few things that I found useful to me. One of them is using different names. For example, for this tutorial, we will be doing a maritime pine, or as it is known in the scientific term, Pinus pinaster, or in the native language, Pinheiro bravo. What I mean by this is, let's say you're starting by searching for maritime pine and you feel like the references just end up being all the same after a while and you want something new, or you're still lacking some of the details, you can try using the scientific name. This will actually be a very important one because it can bring you to some interesting botanical websites. And another one is maybe try to find where that tree is from, where it is mostly widespread, and use the name that is used by the natives of that region. Because people have websites that are, for example, Portuguese websites about trees, and they are small and they might not be indexed by Google when you're searching only in English, so this can bring some new information, which is always cool. You can also try to find websites specific to flora analysis. Biology or botanical research websites are pretty cool because they usually not only have the details written, but they also have a lot of very specific images, and those images are usually good to understand the details that can really be wholesome to make your asset look good in the end. I also recommend saving some of those websites for later times, because sometimes you have more than one species, and if you're doing other vegetation assets, it might be worth searching on those websites. Another thing that I feel is quite important is using videos. Sometimes the images are not enough to understand the depth of things, and watching some videos about it can get you new angles, some motion. It can teach you about how the tree behaves in the wind and other extra stuff that will be useful by the end. Also, try to find actual information. Things like how it grows, what kind of weather does it like, what is the typical height, or what is the radius of the trunk, and other types of details that will help you understand your subject. That's because it makes sense to do some research on that and really understand why your tree is a certain way. Now that I gathered all of my references of different parts of my subject, and as you can see, I have different shapes of the subject that I will be creating, different references of the branches and different angles of them, some even from scanned stuff, from megascans. These will not always be available, but they can be a good thing to study. I don't like to use scans directly, at least for branches, just because I feel like the normals are not always the best ones. Sometimes they are a bit too weak, and also you don't actually control the shapes, but it's a process that can be used, like just scanning stuff and using that instead of creating your own. Some more references of the bark, some references of the cones and the different stages of life that they go through, the needles up close and the color variation that you have on them, that will be interesting to add. And also some context, so these trees are mostly growing in forests, or at least that's my main idea, which means they will not have anything growing in the bottom half of the trunk besides some broken branches. And I think we are set to really start the analysis and looking at it in depth. So at this stage, what I feel you should try to do is understand the what, the how, and the why about your subject. So you essentially want to be asking questions like, how and why does it grow that way? For example, why is this tree not growing anything in the bottom part? And why is it only growing stuff towards the top? And why is it denser towards the top? The reason here, for example, will not only be, of course, the species structure itself, but also the fact that it grows in forests environments and light is harder for them to reach towards the bottom, so the leaves, or in this case the needles, will try to search for light towards the top of the tree. Why does it have that shape? Again, the same thing and essentially the same context. When they are alone, they have a tendency to grow in a more uniform way, but when they are in a forest environment, they have a tendency to only have things grow towards the top. And this is actually something that happens to most trees, so you can see this pattern happening to multiple different tree species. Another thing is, what are the key visual elements that make up the main shape, and what's the structure of the main shape? For this one, for example, it is essentially big branches that then grow smaller towards the tips, and it creates these kind of clusters and interesting negative space. I actually did some really quick work in Photoshop with some contrasting to try and understand the main shapes a bit better, and this is actually a good way to understand your shapes. Another key element is the branches. They do seem a bit random, which can be tricky because looking at different images, you will see that everything seems a bit all over the place. But if you understand the main idea, you essentially have main branches that are attached to the trunk, and then you get some smaller branches with a third level of branches coming from them. And that's where the pine needles grow. And of course, the pine cones is another detail, and then just the kind of typical pine bark. And you can then even consider adding this kind of detail depending on the context you want to give them. And I think this covers essentially the key visual elements and the patterns and structures that your trees have. Those are really the questions you should be asking yourself, and you should use the information you gathered before, even the text information, to help you answer these questions and really look at it and try to make sense of it all. Now, this is important not only to break things up down the line, but it is also a way to add some storytelling to your trees, because storytelling is not necessarily only related to human activity. It can be anything that happens. So if a tree is broken, there is a story behind it. And for example, like I talked about, if you have these holes on the bark, this means that there was something going on here. For example, these ones, they were probably being used for sap, and now that they stopped, the trees are growing back the bark. All of those things will add a lot of character to your final assets. Now that we took a deep dive into what the references show us, and the different elements that exist in each one of them, we can start to do drawings and a breakdown of what we will need to solve our asset. This stage is important to really understand what you will need to create and how you should create it. You don't really need amazing drawing skills, because it's not about making pretty drawings, but rather things that help you understand what is going on. As you can see, my drawing skills are quite weak, but I'm still doing stuff to just wrap my head around what the challenge in front of me is. If we start from the smaller elements, we have the pine needles that you should know how they look because of your references. So they usually grow in pairs, sometimes even more, but I'm used to see the ones that are in pairs. They are kind of glued together towards the bottom. Those needles will grow on the branches directly, and they can get different shapes based on the species you are working on, but for this one I'm actually going for something closer to this look. Then, if you think about these in a modular way, those smaller branches are what makes the bigger ones. So the bigger ones have a middle stem or branch that then has a second level of branches growing out of it, and these ones are basically the tips of those branches. You also get some pine cones growing in the branches, so we can get an example of this. So exactly here, you get the main branch that will be growing from the trunk. Then you get the second one, which is the drawing that I have there. You have the pine needles, and you have some pine cones also growing from it, as you can see. Another thing we will have is some small clusters that will essentially be facing forward towards the tips of the branches. This is a stage where you can already start to think about how you will solve problems, like how will you solve this stuff. Will it be 3D geometry? Will it be in the texture atlas? And how much will each part of it have? I will touch into this in a little second. So these branches essentially will go into the main ones that will be growing from the trunk. And these main ones, I actually noticed that they have a kind of pattern or structure that you notice, where they grow usually facing a little bit upwards. Then they have the force of gravity making them go lower, and towards the tip, they actually go upwards again. So this is a pattern that is not very obvious, but you can start to see it, like here, for example. So yeah, it's interesting because they always seem to do that a little bit, sometimes more, sometimes less, but clearly that effect seems to get stronger towards the top. So that's something to take into consideration. Then we have the main shape, as we previously saw, of an adult tree that would grow in a forest environment. We also have these kind of broken branches that are towards the bottom of the tree, and I already have an idea of how I can solve it once we get to that. And we have other types of broken branches that will be the ones closer to the top, more like what you see here. And my idea is to have like a bigger one, some medium-sized ones, and some smaller and more individual ones that can be used to build them in a modular fashion. As of how we can solve things for the broken branches towards the bottom, my idea is to actually have a trim sheet approach, where we will basically have a cylinder mapped in the UVs to this piece, and the tip of the texture will give me that desired broken branches look. The only way I could get this kind of look would be by having actual 3D geometry, but that would mean like adding a lot of polygons and things start to sum up, and that's not good. Another thing I will be doing is the clusters, as I mentioned, and those ones will be used in 90-degree angles. So if you think about this card as being this main branch, and these ones being the clusters, it is a great way to add a second level of angles to your tree, because we are doing very basic geometry, and in the end it's only cards with textures applied to them. So we need to find ways to actually fake that 3D depth into your tree. So the way you do this is by adding different angles. Actually, adding the sense of depth is probably one of the most important things for vegetation for games, because if you don't find a way to do it, it will always look very 2D and the depth of the tree will be completely off, and you will not really like what you see by the end. And this is just like a quick drawing of how those dead branches would work. You have the main ones and then you have smaller ones with different angles. After I do this analysis, I start thinking about how I can solve these on the texture atlas and how I can organize things a little bit. This is not final, of course. In the blockout stage is when we will actually go into detail and try to fill it as much as possible and try things out. But at the moment, I decided to do a branch that is a little bit bigger and then a smaller one. You will also notice that according to the references I have, that branch, for example, is not what you see here, but rather what you will see here, or maybe even a little bit bigger. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because I want to solve the tree with the least amount of things in the atlas as possible, and the smaller ones will start to add up a lot of poly count because they fill less space. So you need to add more of them, and I'm already trying to think about performance and keeping things simple. So we have a bigger one and then we have a smaller one, and I'm hoping they will solve most of the problems. Then we just have this tiny one that can be used, for example, to add extra angles to this one, or even used, for example, to build a sapling tree. Then we have the broken branches, we have a medium here, then we have a big one and two smaller ones. So this should give you a good base to have variation. We have some smaller pieces here as well, and then the trim sheet kind of approach, as well as the cluster. So this is a rough sketch that should help you solve most of the problems, and you should just make sure you understand your subject and you understand the needs you will have when you move forward. This stage and the next one, which is the blockout phase, are really important to solve things and avoid that you lose time later on.